All right, as folks trickle in, I think we can go ahead and get started. Hey everyone, welcome to our session today. My name is Eric Ran. I'm the head of product marketing here at Moveworks. We have a really fantastic session for you today on how to choose the right chatbot strategy for your business. We chose this topic because we know that a lot of IT leaders are looking to bring in conversational AI and automation to improve the way that they serve their employees. When you're starting out on this journey, it can be hard to quickly understand the landscape and all the available options and decide what is right for you. And that is why we wanted to invite Will McKeon-White to join us today. Will is an analyst on Forrester's infrastructure and operations team who does extensive research on how technology can help you drive better IT and business service delivery. He has a deep understanding of this still fairly new space of chatbots when it comes to employee support. So over the next 40 minutes or so, he'll break down the different approaches in the market, the trade-offs in each approach, and leave you with some really actionable tips to make sure you're successful. Submit all your questions in the chat, and we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. And look out for a couple of survey questions for you throughout the session as well. With that, over to you, Will.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eric. Howdy, everybody. Will McKeon-White, analyst at Forrester Research, and thank you for having me today. So without any further ado, going to flip on over to the agenda. But so over the past 4 years or so, we've had almost an innumerable number of conversations with organizations looking to adopt conversational interfaces, chatbots, virtual agents, what have you, and trying to understand some of the pros and cons of the different approaches, the costs associated, and how they can really actually succeed in these initiatives. And so we wanted to take some of these insights and share them with you today. But so to start, we wanted to provide you with a bit of a framework about how we think about the chatbot market, because honestly, it's a little bit hard to track, even as somebody whose job that is. There are so many different offerings and types of offerings available that it's very much a difficult, very much a full-time job just to keep track of who is who. But so we wanted to provide you with this quick way of understanding the different tools that are available today and some of the pros and cons of these approaches. So overall, we tend to see that there are really 4 different chatbot approaches available in the market today that organizations can adopt. The first of them being toolboxes, or much more of a do-it-yourself type approach. The second type are the platform integrated chatbots, or conversational interfaces that are designed to help you interact with a specific platform. Then there are virtual agents, or usually very multi-capable conversational engines that are able to be applied to a lot of different applications. And automation aggregators, which are able to really work off of tools that you have today and apply conversational intelligence and AI to them. But so when it comes to the pros and cons of toolboxes, they, as I just said, they tend to focus much more on DIY. They provide you with a significant amount of flexibility. They can be free to use and are often based on open source projects that increase the availability of skill sets or people who have actually had experience with them in the market, which is critical, as a lot of these platforms, or is this is a very new space today. But there are some distinct cons we've found in talking to organizations who have adopted this. These platforms tend to require a significant amount of development investment and ongoing tuning and optimization, even for the most basic of conversational functions, which can take significantly more time than a lot of organizations have expected or budgeted for originally. Costs often scale with usage, and we'll talk a bit about the different cost models in a bit, but one of the more common cost models that we tend to see is per interaction. And so as you use a solution more, you end up paying more money for it, which disincentivizes applying it across your organization. And then again, success is dependent on your adopter skill or the existing skill sets that you have within your organization and your chatbot development competency, which is a little bit harder than a lot of folks give it credit for. But then one of the most other common instances or common approaches that we tend to see being applied in the market and that we see as available to adopt today are platforms, or in-platform automation capabilities for these broader suites or solutions. The benefits here is that these are often included with the platform's cost. You don't necessarily need to pay additionally to use these solutions. and they're natively integrated into the platform. Integrations can take up a significant amount of time of any implementation or any chatbot implementation initiative. And so anything that can be used to accelerate it for strategic solutions is a massive time saver on the adopter's part. And it can make it easier to actually use the native platform, whatever it is that you have here. Whatever the platform in usage is today, it actually allows you to interact with it significantly easier and allows you to, say, onboard new employees to it much faster than you otherwise would be able to. But that's also sort of part of the problem here, is that these are often limited to platform usage and don't necessarily scale outside of the solution. And so integrating that platform with, or integrating that chatbot, I should say, with a third-party solution outside of the platform can be tricky, if not impossible. It might require, additionally, some manual configuration or adjustment, which again takes time to make it useful. And it might not meet the extent of your organizational needs because the capabilities will ultimately be determined by that platform provider. And in certain circumstances, that might not fit what it is you're envisioning to do with a conversational interface. Then there are virtual agents. And these can allow you to accelerate conversational interfaces across a wide variety of use cases. And these often have some of the most highly performing when it comes to advanced language processing capabilities. And they often also have advanced analytics, which is something that we very much prize in the marketplace. We'll talk a bit about this in just a moment. But we find that a lot of adopters don't necessarily know how they should be applying chatbots today. And advanced analytics provide you the insight into what you should be doing with the solution next, or what is working and what isn't. And then they also often have pre-configured modules which help accelerate the time to value. But on the downside, they often run at a high usage cost. Some of them today still use a per interaction basis as well. And so while you might have very advanced capabilities and you might be able to apply these to a wide variety of different applications, it's definitely a cost trade-off where you can use these widely, but at the same time, they'll cost you a significant amount internally. And they also can still require some manual configuration and tuning, and often require dedicated development efforts. It's not uncommon in our conversations with folks who are adopting virtual agents today that they have up to 10 developers specifically dedicated towards just the building out of these conversations, building out of integrations, identifying what works and what doesn't. And depending on the organization, you can either have the budget for that, or for a lot of organizations, it's just a little bit out of reach to spend so much time developing out these capabilities. But then finally, the fourth category we see in the market are automation aggregators. These are also the newest approach that we've started to see emerging. And we've seen a lot of success with this approach recently on the part of adopters, because often they have extensive pre-configured assets and a very fast time to useful. And this usefulness will be something that I will talk about quite a lot during this webinar. They also allow you to leverage existing platform investments, because the last thing that any organization wants to do is extensive rework just to get basic functionality up and running. So being able to leverage what you already have goes a long way benefiting you as an organization, and they often require little to no configuration or development. On the downside, though, they do often have a higher list cost than others, but thankfully don't scale with usage in the same way that other pricing models do. But that upfront cost can be enough to turn some adopters off of these solutions. They might have a little bit less flexibility than other platforms, or you might lack support for code level access, for example, or be somewhat limited in the deployment clouds that they support, or they might be more focused on specific use cases than other platforms. And when you have that less flexibility, you might have to temper your expectations or temper your plans as to where this can be applied immediately. For example, some might be focused very much on customer support, and others might be focused on employee support and only have capabilities within those realms. But with all that said, in our Chatbots for IT Operations wave that we performed last year, that was published in Q4 2020, we found that there really were two criteria that came out as strongly differentiated offerings. And we actually stated this explicitly in the wave document as well. And I believe that there's actually a copy of this wave available for those who would want to, from courtesy of Moveworks. But the two things that we found made the difference for adopters in that wave were really chatbot readiness, as well as optimization and analytics. On the chatbot readiness perspective, it again, talking about that time to usefulness, the faster that you can deploy this into your organization, the faster you can get it running, the faster that you can actually make this useful to your organization and start to justify some of these costs associated, the more successful your initiative will be. And the faster you'll be able to endear it to your customers, whether it's your employees or external customers. This allows you to significantly accelerate your implementation and actually use these solutions like how you probably want to today. And then optimization and analytics is very much an emerging area, but something that is increasingly important for the scaling of these capabilities across the different use cases they might be applied to, whether it's something like HR, IT, facilities, being able to identify gaps today, as well as make a difference in closing those gaps is something that we see as strongly differentiating in this market. But that's sort of the high level 101 of how we at Forrester break down the market, what we see as differentiating, what we feel organizations need to be adopting or should be prioritizing in terms of their adoption. And one of the things that comes up time and time again with customers, however, is we don't know necessarily what this will cost us, whether or not that's explicitly articulated to us. There's been a lot of instances where we had conversations around or with organizations who don't necessarily know the costs of conversational interfaces. They don't know what each one of these different approaches might be incurring. And it's worth noting that regardless of your strategy, conversational interfaces or using chatbots will cost money. That is something that is often misrepresented in the market or misassumed, but everything unfortunately comes at a cost here. And so understanding what those costs are is really critical to ensure your long-term success with this approach. And so these are some of the most common commercial models that we see organizations or that we see available in the market for purchasing of these solutions. And oftentimes many platforms have a mix, but it's worth noting that even the ones that are theoretically free upfront do still have costs associated, and we'll talk a little bit as to what that can look like in a second. But one of the models that we tend to see is the open source or no upfront charge or free to a certain point. This tends to be the most interesting to adopting organizations, of course, because why wouldn't you want a free platform? But it's worth noting that this comes at a very high development cost very frequently for adopters. Then there's per transaction and per usage. We're at Forrester not necessarily big fans of this because it prevents organizations from actually adopting these tools as widely as they would want. Very often per transaction is of significant interest for adopters because this allows them to scale this to apply it in a very banded way and to scale costs with usage. But at the same time, very often this becomes untenable and the costs actually eclipse what it might otherwise be on a per user basis. Then there's the platform enterprise license agreement. We see this very often with the platform tooling. Then there's per use case, which is costs per application, whether that, again, that's IT, HR, customer success. This is becoming increasingly common and something we're kind of fans of, but at the same time, it can prevent that wider adoption of these solutions internally. And then finally, there's per user, which is the most straightforward of the different pricing options. And it's worth noting, again, that we do tend to see a mix of being applied here. And so you might have a per use case, but you also might have the option as per user. And so there's a few considerations that we're going to be talking about when it comes to assessing which commercial model is right for you. However, we tend to recommend prioritizing those that incentivize scaling and allow you to flex with your needs. Very often, things like per transaction usage might seem flexible, but ultimately might lock you into very high cost models that aren't the best for your intended application here. And so in understanding where some of these more hidden costs might be appearing, we developed this quick, cute little cost continuum, trying to better articulate that regardless of what it is that you're going at, or sorry, I should say, regardless of the cost model that you're selecting, you're still going to be paying money for the solution. It either comes out in development time, or ultimately in the licensing cost. And so it's up to you to decide where is most appropriate for you to fall in this continuum, though we do have a recommendation specifically on that a little bit later in the presentation as well. But we found that the more development time, usually the less that the upfront cost tends to be, but this is still a cost. And we'll talk a bit about what that's costed some organizations as well. And then when you pay a significant amount on the other end of the continuum, where you buy a pre-made solution, it tends to have a significantly less development costs upfront associated. And so this was a conversation that we had with a large US bank about 2 years ago, who were going at this from a DIY or build your own strategy. They were using a commercial product, and so they were still paying some licensing costs, but they were finding that the biggest costs incurred to them was actually in the development time, because in this case, they had senior developers experienced with things like machine learning and chatbot development, each one of them making $300,000 a year, effectively just sitting in a room saying if conversations were good or not, pressing the yay or nay button, which suffice to say annoyed quite a few of them, because at this point, these were folks who were very well versed in their craft, were compensated significantly, and wanted to be doing something a little bit more value add than just giving the pass or fail approach here. But this was ultimately what they found was required in order to actually make their solution useful to their customers. And so when we're talking a bit about this, talking a bit about the cost continuum here, it's important to understand that development time is not free. Very often we see organizations say, oh, we can just pass this to a developer or somebody can do this in the part-time. That is not the case. And very often this will spiral out of your estimations very quickly if you don't properly plan for this. And it's worth noting as well, there's a bunch of additional hidden costs that we tend to see associated with chatbots. In our conversations we've had with adopters, we found that chatbots are hard. These can be very tricky to get right, and it requires you to spend that significant amount of time in development if you're doing this yourself. We tend to recommend actually using as much pre-made solutions, whether that's from an open source repository or whether it's from a enterprise agreement, or whether it's from a licensing costs that you pay to a company to provide this for you. We tend to recommend doing that because they are so hard, and you don't necessarily want to be reinventing the wheel every single time you want to implement a chatbot. There's no sense in that, and that often comes at the detriment of your users. Related to that, there is a fast usefulness required for return on investment, because as we've unfortunately seen on a few different occasions, when users don't feel the chatbot is useful, or where it's not able to recognize what it is they're trying to do, when it's preventing them from getting assistance in whatever it is that they're doing, they will abandon the platform. And in certain cases, this costs organizations quite a bit of money, either in the development investment they've already spent or in terms of licensing costs, because it wasn't useful to the users. They weren't ever actually able to pay off that initial investment. Then there's a long tail of application we found with chatbots. And so having a very banded understanding of how it is you're going to be applying these, as well as how you're going to be investing in the ongoing optimization of these solutions, whether through yourself or with an agreement with the vendor, that's critical because there is such a long tail of application. We have found organizations who have adopted these can automate 40 to 60% of, per se, inbound IT requests. But at the same time, with each point of improvement, with each point of automation they've achieved, it's required them more and more time cumulatively with each one of these in order to expand it out further, because each use case you're going to be running into is more and more of an edge case coming up less and less frequently. And you need to actually have the appropriate coverage of all of these to ensure that it's actually useful to your end users. And then interaction-based charges, we talked a bit about that briefly earlier. These scale with usage, and if your solution is successful, it can incur significantly more than you were expecting or budgeting for, which tends to make folks responsible for finance a little bit unhappy, because everybody wants predictable costs these days because of the unpredictability that we've all been experiencing. And so making sure that you're aware of this factor, as well as being careful with how much you scale the solution, is a recommendation for folks who are pursuing this route. And then training time decreases user goodwill. I'm sorry, I can't help you isn't necessarily a good enough excuse for not being able to provide folks with assistance. That is a direct quote we've heard from people who are angry at the chatbot that they're using. And so ensuring that you have a relatively fast time to usefulness and a relatively low training time is critical to ensure that people are actually still willing to use your platform and won't seek external or won't seek to circumnavigate your solution in order to get that assistance. And then finally, we're seeing that a lot of organizations who have chosen the DIY path are ultimately requiring a lot of professional services. Excuse me, just because a lot of the skill sets that they need, whether that's experience in conversational design, experience in linguistics, translation, advanced integration experience, a lot of these aren't available on the part, or aren't present, I should say, in their development organizations today. And so they need professional services in order to supplement these out. And that turns what might be originally considered a free solution into one that costs multiple hundreds of thousands very quickly. And so just making sure that you're aware of all these potentials for hidden costs is some of the best advice we can give, because so many organizations we've talked to have unfortunately run into these the hard way before. And what started out as a well-intentioned initiative is spiraling out of control on these adopting organizations, to the point where nobody wants to use the chatbot. It's already cost them multiple hundreds of thousands, and they don't necessarily have a good path forward. That is the last thing that we want to happen to you, because we want to make chatbots useful for everybody, because everybody deserves an easy-to-use interface. And just relating to that, sort of one of those instances where something was spiraling out of control, we talked to a healthcare organization who actually spent 6 months personally developing the chatbot with, again, a bunch of highly paid developers. And they actually had to pull it out of production after it had launched, because the overall recognition rate, or intent recognition rate, was something along the lines of 60% or so. They weren't actually able to recognize 4 out of every 10 conversations that were coming into it, and thus made it useless to those adopters. And they eventually were able to write this using retraining it on certain data that they actually didn't know they had access to. But this entire initiative took them ultimately 9 months to get it to a point where users still weren't trusting it, because they had that poor experience previously. Talking about hidden costs, this was something they were totally unprepared to deal with, because they had assumed that things would be it would be able to understand these requests out of the box, and that they weren't necessarily aware up front of all the different complexities involved with the chatbot development. And so I want to take a quick pause here just to open this poll to the floor, because this is something that we're going to be talking a bit about in a second here. But we wanted to get a better understanding of what is your primary business reason for considering a chatbot today. What motivates your organization? Because this will determine whether or not you are going about this the right way or not. Not to put any pressure on anybody, but give it just a moment here. And also, in the meantime, it's worth noting, if you have any questions on any of the material that we're presenting, would like a bit of clarification on what we've said so far, please let us know in the chat or in the Q&A section, and we'll do our best to we can either address that in flow or at the end during the Q&A section. Always more than happy to answer questions as they come up. Excellent. And so we see thank you, everybody, for taking the poll. And so we've actually got some of the results up front already. And it seems that improved employee experience and improved productivity are the top 2, which is excellent to see. And we'll be talking a bit about why that's a good thing in just a moment here. There we go. And so on the next section, we wanted to share 5 tips for actually ensuring that your chatbot is successful internally, regardless of the approach that you choose, and some key considerations to keep in mind when actually pursuing a conversational interface or a chatbot being implemented in your organization. But the number 1 piece of advice that I would have to say is keep usefulness top of mind, because ultimately your end users will determine the success of your initiative. And so to quickly summarize the pieces of advice that we have here, we have these 5 points. 1, build a platform team and get cross-organizational input into the solution. Number 2, keep that user experience as a top priority. Number 3, don't reinvent the wheel, as we've said. Make sure to be using out of the box wherever possible. Number 4, plan a practical rollout and actually make sure your chatbot works before overpromising. And finally, number 5, measure what actually really matters. And that is, of course, user success. But so one of the pieces of advice that we've found is increasingly key for organizations pursuing a conversational interface or a chatbot is to make sure that you actually have a team managing your chatbot initiative. And so this is the organizational structure that we tend to find works the best, making sure you have a core management team who's actually able to dictate the strategy and able to actually take input from the variety of different applications that can be used in, making sure you actually have dedicated resources to the optimization of the platform to make sure that all the resources you need are available for it, and making sure you're actually talking with your users. This, for some reason, is sometimes the most, some of the most differentiating advice that we give is actually ask your users before going into production if it's useful or not. And then finally, make sure you're interacting with subject matter experts for the areas where you're trying to support, regardless of what it is, whether it's IT, whether it's sales, whether it's finance, whether it's customer success and support, making sure you actually have those conversations between the team as well as these external organizations, or not external, but other organizations internally, to ensure that you're actually making the right decisions. Because one of the biggest issues we've seen organizations facing really over the past year has been this massive proliferation of strategies and of solutions internally. We talked to a multinational consumer packaged goods manufacturer fairly recently, I think within the last 6 months, and they told us that they have 13 different chatbots internally, all competing for attention and resources. And these were all brought in through a variety of legitimate ways. There was a few shadow instances running around as well, but these were all the tools that were selected by a specific organization in order to help them automate their work, in order to solve customer problems. And each one of these internally was directly competing with one another, creating a not great experience across the board, and actually just ultimately replicating the same internal silos that they were actually trying to reduce. They were actually trying to make cross-functional work more common, and these chatbots ultimately ended up just increasing the confusion and reducing down this collaboration. And so this is really one of the key reasons for building this core management team, making it so that a few folks ultimately have say over what solutions are being used and can assess their success internally, as well as appropriateness for this conversational function. And one of the other things that this team is responsible for is actually reaching out to folks like on HR, IT, finance, making sure that their platform is meeting their needs, doing things like interviews with these customers to actually make sure that whatever it is that they're doing is useful ultimately. And also gathering funding and creating a shared pool of funding to actually purchase or fund one of these initiatives. Because very often we see 13 different chatbots being present in an organization because everybody was flying by the seat of their pants trying to purchase what they could, or doing a DIY solution in order to meet their needs. What this allows you to do is actually pool resources together to make sure whatever it is that you start on, you can actually not only complete, but make ultimately differentiating to your organization. And speaking of pooled resources, the developers or knowledge-based team here actually should create these capabilities internally in your solution to fuel out the amount of resources, resources that your chatbot has access to, and to allow you to actually better manage for the solution and to create better optimized offerings here, whether that is an integration into a platform, whether that's a workflow, whether that is just a knowledge article, better explaining some knowledge that people need access to. Because very often we found that knowledge development in teams is not necessarily something that is done for external resource. And very often knowledge bases are one of the sort of most commonly used assets to provide for self-service. And very often they're just not designed for that. So actually having people who can revamp these knowledge articles to make them user-facing, to make them ultimately useful to individuals, and to actually have this shared pool of resource and talent to ensure that this is successful is one of the biggest reasons we recommend for building out this team. And then it also allows you to better centralize end user champions or users who will ultimately be determining if your tool succeeds or fails. Making sure to actually ask the people who will be using this on a day-to-day, whether it's an HR individual, HR representative, or actually somebody on the line of business who will be using this to get support from HR. These will provide you the ultimate test as to whether or not your strategy is working or it's failing today. And then finally, of course, making sure you're actually working with people whose jobs or whose lives you're trying to make easier. Actually, it will help you ensure the relevance here. And very often we see these last two, specifically the end user champions and the subject matter experts, being excluded from these conversations because they're not centralized, because they're happening within a specific realm, and folks are running off attempting to be useful without necessarily taking the proper considerations. And very often we find that this is not going at it from this perspective leads to, again, the 13 different chatbots running around internally, as well as failed initiatives ultimately, because they haven't actually understood the needs of their customers and instead are attempting to solve for a problem that they have identified, but might not actually be that differentiating to the organization internally. And related to that, and as we've said, making sure that you actually keep user experience your top priority is important, not just because this, will be useful to your users, but it's actually ultimately does determine the success of your initiative. Whether if you're just adopting a chatbot to save money and you aren't necessarily optimizing for the user experience, this is a fast way to ensure that users don't use your solution and that your initiative was actually a waste of resources. Whereas if you're prioritizing to make it effective in providing support and actually make your chatbot useful, this tends to better endear it to users, then allows you to actually improve the performance of your organization overall. And so we see this path on the right being critical in order to actually gain the benefits of a chatbot solution internally. Whereas if you're going at this just from a cost-saving initiative, it won't be as effective, and ultimately cost you more money than a solution better optimized for those users. Because ultimately, everyone using your chatbot is looking to accomplish something. No one is just investigating what your platform can do, at least not beyond the first few days. If you are actually preventing that person from getting the support that they need, regardless of what it is, whether they're trying to reserve a table or get their password reset internally, or trying to get a new laptop, or trying to figure out how many holidays there are in the year, or if there's an upcoming holiday. Somebody who is using your platform is looking to accomplish something. Making sure they can do that is a quick way to ensure your chatbot will be successful and to ensure that that person will continue to come back to it as their first point of support. And because of this, chatbots should always accelerate support and never prevent it. Very often we find organizations, especially from the cost-cutting perspective, are trying to reduce down the number of interactions that go to humans as their primary objective. Very often this results in a chatbot acting as a gatekeeper rather than as an accelerator to that support. And so making sure that you are building out your strategy as to how these can actually, how users can interact with your chatbot and how the chatbot can actually interact ultimately then with support agents, regardless of whatever the use case that you're trying to apply this to is. This ensures that no matter what, your user will always be able to get the assistance they need, and your chatbot will not be a gatekeeper, rather something that is seen as a net positive for that user. So making sure this is one of the guiding principles here is critical to ensure that they're ultimately following that right-hand path to ensure that the users can accomplish whatever it is that they're looking to accomplish. And one way to sort of further reduce down the, friction of using any chatbot solution is to also just make it clear how you're there to help them. Very often we've seen very well-intentioned chatbots not properly articulate what they can do to the users. And so then the users are stuck in this almost hall of mirrors, if you will, where they are trying to determine what the chatbot is capable of, and instead of getting support, ultimately are forced to get support from a human rather than quickly using what the chatbot is capable of. Then to also, again, accelerate this time to useful that we've been talking about, make sure you're using pre-made wherever possible. Pre-existing assets provide the missing piece of many organizations in their chatbot puzzle, because a lot of folks are ultimately, when doing DIY chatbot development, reinventing the wheel. That is not something you should be spending your time on. And instead, you should be focusing on making sure your chatbot is useful and that it's optimized for whatever it is the users might be coming to you for. And so using pre-made helps you accelerate that process and really reduces down the amount of time it takes for you to actually get this into production and get this in front of customers who will ultimately be able to tell you if you're on the right track or not. And when it comes to organizational strategy and what we would recommend for organizations to do, we very often find that in conversations with folks who have not adopted a chatbot today, 50-50, we find the split to be 50-50 in terms of who believes that they can adopt a pre-made solution, or who believes they should adopt a pre-made solution, who believes they should adopt a do-it-yourself solution. After folks have adopted their first chatbot, we tend to find that proportion goes down to 80-20, where 80% believe that they should be adopting a pre-made solution and 20% believe that they should be adopting a DIY, because there are still use cases that apply for both, but overall, many organizations are not properly suited to do a in-house development effort. And so making sure you're adequately assessing your own internal maturity, as well as your capacity for development and your funding for ongoing development optimization. This is a real soul-searching activity that we believe is critical for organizations to do before they begin that initiative. Because let's just build a chatbot is easy to say, but it is incredibly hard to do. And then again, one of the things that the healthcare organization, I should say, was having trouble with before was that they weren't actually using real interaction records. That's pretty basic to making sure that this is useful. So making sure that you're actually speaking the way that your users expect you to be is pretty fundamental to ensuring that it's useful in the long run. Then advice number 4, make sure you're planning a practical rollout and making sure your chatbot is working before overpromising. And so make sure that you get a specific use case good before expanding it out to everything that everybody else wants to, because chatbots aren't a magical solve-all yet, I should say. While many organizations hope that they will be, they won't be able to solve all the different problems that you have internally, and instead should be used tactically in order to improve the experience of people trying to get support, for example. And so in this example of a rollout, we see an organization who is struggling when it comes to rolling it out to a HR and facilities help desk. Instead of skipping along to providing a full employee help desk, they're actually spending the time here in order to make sure that it's useful to those end users and make sure that it's actually properly processing their requests. And so making sure that you're using pre-made assets and dedicated platform teams to help fuel the cycle and to help spend time to make sure that make sure you can actually improve it for your end users really accelerates the process and allows you to spend the time you need in order to make sure it's useful. And then also invest in ongoing optimization. Very often organizations say the chatbot goes into production, then you leave it. That's not the case at all. That's just the beginning of the journey. And so making sure that you have a team that's actually dedicated to ensuring that the chatbot is successful for your end users is really a core foundation to your ongoing success here, not just to the initial reception. And then at the very end here, make sure you're measuring what matters. Again, it is that user success, and success is determined by that usefulness. Some metrics that we recommend tracking in order to get a better understanding of the holistic outcome of your solution are these 6, I should say, intent recognition rate, number of drop conversations you have, number of interactions per user, the user MTTR or mean time to resolution, the chatbot ticket deflection rate, and finally the total outcome score. If somebody has the same problem, would they go about resolving it in the same way? And the last piece of advice that we have to do, relatively simple but done very infrequently. If you're not sure if something is working, always make sure to ask. Very frequently, we see teams feel that they're forced to sort of operate in isolation and don't necessarily have good relationships with their customers. That's probably one of the worst situations to be in with a chatbot, because ultimately, again, that user usefulness will determine that success. And so make sure you are having those conversations frequently and transparently. And that is all I had prepared today. But so over to you, Eric.
Great. Thank you so much, Will, for such an informative and useful session. Hope you found that useful. For those of you who are considering solutions that work out of the gate, I wanted to give you all a quick intro to Moveworks. And while I do that, be sure to add your questions you have for Will into the Q&A, and we'll address those at the end. So at our core, Moveworks is an AI company that can help you give your employees exactly what they need instantly and automatically. The way most employees experience Moveworks is through a chatbot that lives inside your messaging platform, Microsoft Teams, Slack, and others, as you saw on the previous slide. Many of our customers deploy Moveworks as a single bot for any support-related request. So not just IT issues, but also HR inquiries, finance questions, and more, thanks to our deep domain classification and understanding. And how are we able to do this? We're able to do this because we sit within your technology stack, and we do several things in a matter of seconds for each request coming in. First, if you start from the left-hand side, we intercept issues no matter how they're submitted. The most common way to engage Moveworks is through an enterprise messaging platform, but customers can also deploy the same Moveworks bot to enterprise portals, such as ServiceNow or SharePoint. And for employees who email your support teams or file a ticket through a portal, we can also capture, understand, and resolve those issues as well. We then run every request through dozens of machine learning models and understand the true meaning behind each request, and also decide in real time the best action or path forward. So these are not pre-scripted, predetermined solutions. We decide that in real time. And then finally, on the right-hand side, we take immediate action, provision the app, unlock an account, find the right policy information, or accelerate it and get it in the hands of the right person or support team for help. And we're able to do all this because we integrate deeply within your ITSM solution, your identity solution, all of your knowledge bases, email systems, and more. The best part is you can deploy Moveworks in weeks. So our customers deploy Moveworks in about 8 weeks and get immediate value on day one. And because we're constantly improving our AI machine learning models, your Moveworks bot gets smarter over time with no additional maintenance or investment on your side. The best part of the deployment, and also as part of that deployment, we'll also work with you to custom brand your bot so that it can be the unique face for employee service within your organization. You can see that many examples of our customers' bots on this slide. And so because of all this and our approach to making sure you're successful, our customers are able to get faster time to value, what Will talked about today as that fast time to useful. And that value typically falls into 3 categories. You just go back one slide. That's increasing operational efficiency, improving that employee experience, and accelerating business transformation. I'll give you a couple quick examples. On the operational efficiency side, Western Digital, they were able to reduce their outsourced L1 service desk contract by about 25 people. That was huge. And for others, it's not about reducing people, but it's about freeing their team, their support team or their experts to focus on higher value work. On the employee experience side, I'm really glad based on our survey and poll to see that employee experience is one of the top priorities or common reasons to evaluate a solution. At Unity, for example, almost every employee has gotten instant support from Moveworks, over 92% of their employee base. At Nutanix, the median time for Moveworks to resolve an issue was 7 seconds. And we're doing that for more than half of their IT tickets. That's really game-changing for productivity and the perception of the support within the company. And finally, Moveworks makes change really easy. So whether that's managing hypergrowth or integrating an entirely new workforce after an acquisition, Broadcom, for example, was able to onboard 11,000 employees that came through an acquisition and make sure that they were all productive starting day one, thanks to their Moveworks bot. So very quick overview. If you're interested in learning more or seeing Moveworks in action, be sure to request a demo through this link here, moveworks.com/demo. Great. And tell us if you'd like to. Fantastic. Great.
Excellent.
Well, at this point, I'm seeing some questions coming in through the Q&A, and let's talk about a couple of them here. Looks like, Will, looks like Dyke has a question here for the whole, for you. How does the tool decision criteria change based on whether use cases are primarily focused on content answer delivery, as opposed to focused on update execution, like change my address or things like that?
That's a very good question, and a little bit tricky to answer, mostly because I would say that from a user perspective, that's what we tend to default to as well. When somebody is asking for information, very frequently that is also followed by an execution request. So if somebody is saying, how many days off do I, or what's my time off schedule like today, or how many hours do I have? Very frequently, the next thing that they'll ask is, can I take off time next Tuesday, or can I take off so-and-so date? And so I would actually say that they are very similar in terms of decision criteria, because very often we see organizations finding that they need to adopt both. Because while a Q&A bot might be very helpful for reducing down the most common requests, making sure you also do have some capability in terms of performing an action is a pretty critical conjoint capability, because that tends to manifest very fast after those questions are asked.
Yeah, it makes sense. And so, Will, you're saying being able to take immediate action, regardless of the breadth of use cases. And also I heard, within this question, being able to make sure a solution can deliver a personalized answer, right, is often a requirement based on who's asking.
I very much agree with that.
Another question we see is, if we are considering building a chatbot ourselves in an organization, what skill sets or capabilities would we need on our team?
At the very least, I would recommend having somebody who has built a chatbot before. Again, we talked a bit about how those could be those skills can be very highly in demand and can be a little bit hard to acquire. Very often don't necessarily have those capabilities internally already, but making sure you have somebody who knows what a chatbot is and has gone through some of the same trials and tribulations we've seen, or other organizations who have adopted these have gone through so far. Making sure that they have experience there is critical to ensure that you at least have somebody who can guide your solution to a better outcome. We'd also recommend experience within things like linguistics, not from a technical perspective, but good understanding of language, making sure that somebody has the ability to build in integrations into your solution, into your existing environments, making sure that somebody has a good understanding of internal workflows at your organization. Usually platform, you need input from the platform teams as well. So if you're connecting into ServiceNow, for example, making sure that you have buy-in from the ServiceNow team and that those people are part of your part of this discussion is pretty important there. We also recommend having people who are experienced within employee experience as well, who know what drives employee experience forward. Usually, again, being able to make progress and part of your daily tasks, ensuring that you have all of those different skills within the development team is usually what we'd recommend if you're going at this from a DIY perspective. And of course, just the traditional development skill sets and whatever language the chatbot or natural language engine supports.
Thank you, Will. Yeah, and just to add on to that, I mean, you mentioned linguistics and language capabilities. What is the pattern or pitfall that you see with clients that perhaps don't have that deep expertise in trying to ensure that their solution can feel conversational?
Very often that tends to result in folks having chatbots that don't understand what people are asking. Very often we'd find that development organizations tend to pivot towards technical in terms of the language that they use, and that isn't necessarily the case throughout the rest of the organization. Again, part of the reason why we recommend having end users actually as part of these conversations and not just having this be the remit of one developer team, because people, DIY teams will usually do their best in approximating what they believe or how they believe people are speaking about these problems that they're facing. Very rarely is that actually the case, because people are very inventive and their permutations of very basic sentences. And especially when you're interacting with something like a chatbot, the formality of your language or the specificity of your language tends to drop. And so you need to compensate both for how people are comfortable using, how people are talking about their problems, as well as how people are actually referring to them. And
Great,
I
thank
see
you, Will.
we also have something in from Q&A. I believe that's a question for you, Eric.
Yeah, I see that from Gaurav. Do you guys also support, do customer-facing solutions like for customer support and order management? The answer is no, we do not at this time. We're very much focused on the internal employee service use cases and solutions. We've spent many years with dozens of engineers, machine learning engineers and experts really focusing on that world and making sure that we understand the universe of employee support requests and all the things that they can ask, as well as making sure that we can resolve their issue and take immediate action, as we talked about. And I think because of that laser focus for us, we're seeing a lot of these great results that I called out within our customer base. Well, question that we have for you here: how have you seen organizations justify the upfront costs of buying a solution?
Good question. So that's actually one of the reasons why we tend to recommend creating, I think I briefly touched on this, but one of the reasons why I recommend creating that centralized chatbot team is actually so you have a stronger business case across multiple different domains in order to justify some of those upfront costs if you are purchasing a pre-developed solution. Because very often you'll get the question of why aren't you using one of the open source elements here, but instead having the folks who are able to actually develop out the business case to assess the positives are assess the actual underlying costs as well as the projected benefits is something that a centralized team should do, as well as it allows you to, again, pool your resources, pool budget from these different teams who anticipate getting some sort of benefit or who you will be eventually supporting within their various use cases, whether it is, again, the IT, HR, customer success and support. Making sure you have buy-in from these organizations helps you actually do even things like chargeback, if that is applicable there. But that, as a whole, we find provides you with a much stronger basis for purchasing a more expensive solution versus a lot of the teams who have to go at this independently are forced to ultimately use something that doesn't have that upfront charge, but ultimately might cost them more in the long run.
Great. Thank you, Will. Any other questions from the team and attendees here today? Great. Well, thank you all for attending the session. Hope you found it really useful. Will, thank you so much for your time and joining us.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Hope to see you all soon.